you for having me on your podcast. I appreciate it. I'll give you a little bit of my background. I've been dealing with the politics of climate change for over a decade. I wrote a book in 2014 about the international negotiations for Kyoto and the politics that are involved with that. I've been more focused on the politics, especially in the US, of climate change. Well, why is the politics so important? The science of climate change has been around since the middle 1950s. And every single year, the science has just become stronger and stronger that climate change is a threat to us, that we have to deal with it. It's caused by us. It's mainly caused by the burning of fossil fuels. But governments haven't done enough. And the one that's done the least is actually the United States. You're talking about the most powerful country in the world, the richest country in the world. They have to lead by example. And so science isn't going to solve this for us. We have to resolve this problem, this monster that's out there. And that monster is politics, and then especially in the United States. And the problem in the United States is basically the Republican Party.
So how this climate change is impacting the planet?
Well, the obvious one that people know about, it's global warming is almost always used. And that's what the greenhouse effect does. And the greenhouse effect is from greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the best known one, causes a warming of the atmosphere. And the problem is that you do get more heat waves and there's more problem with high temperatures. But the real danger is from extreme weather events. So when the temperature rises, extreme weather increases. And so you have a double effect of temperature directly, but then the changes in the climate, the changes in the weather patterns. We've seen over and over again, there's been areas hard hit by wildfires, by drought, by heat domes, by flooding. And it's just going to get worse until we stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So can you tell some statistics?
I don't have hard stats on that. They're available to me. The interesting about stats on extreme weather, they're affected by lots of things. But what science knows is whether you look at data on, let's say, flooding, whether that has increased as far as the global stats are concerned. Lots of time, the global stats aren't sensitive enough to pick up what climate change is doing because other factors are also involved. But the one thing that science does know is that climate change is making these issues worse. For example, a paper just came out today, I believe, on the horrible flooding that took place in Pakistan. And that study, they're called attribution studies, said that probably 50% of the cause of those floods had come from climate change. And they've done similar studies about the wildfires that hit in California and in Australia in the past. And it varies. It can vary from a small amount to a high amount, like 30 or 40%. But weather is quite chaotic. So other factors come into it. And so the actual bare bones stats don't always show this properly.
So tell me about climate politics.
Climate politics is a nightmare. What you have is that, I'll deal with the United States because that's the one I've looked at the most. And for most areas of the world, it's the most important because they have to get their act together if the world's going to get their act together. The politics of climate change, what's happened is that the Republican Party has adopted climate denialism. And what climate denialism means is that they deny the science of climate change. And that science states is that climate change is here now. It's real. It's caused by us. It's going to keep on getting worse until we do something about it. And so by denying it, they can use it as an excuse not to do anything about it. But the problem is it's really a coward's way out. Because just because they deny the science hasn't changed. The science is still real. There's still that threat that's constantly out there. So somehow we have to overcome that barrier. There's two things that spread the climate denialism among any groups, but especially true in the US. It's political ideology. The more right-wing you are, there's more of a tendency to deny science when you happen to disagree with it. You don't like what it's telling you. But what inflames that ideology is propaganda. And the propaganda, there's been a massive public relations program for the last few decades, sponsored by the fossil fuel industry, especially the oil industry, spreading lies and misinformation about climate change science and scientists. And what happens is when you're already looking for reasons not to accept something, like the right wing often does with climate change, they just use this propaganda as a way of making an excuse so they don't have to do it.
So you're saying this is not being taken very seriously?
I think it's been taken seriously, but often for the wrong reasons. What they're doing is that denialism is a psychological effect. Denialism was a symptom that Sigmund Freud had discovered. And what denialism is when you hear the truth. It doesn't matter what that truth is, but you hear the truth and you're scared of what that truth is. It's a human instinct to deny it. The extreme of that comes up with climate denialism. What happens with many right-wing individuals is they don't like regulations. They like small government. They want business to take care of problems. And so when you look at climate change, it's just against what they stand for. And so they see it as an attack on their principles. And so, as I said, the propaganda just reinforces that. And that's why I spend so much time attacking the propaganda. I can't change someone's ideology. I wouldn't even try to change someone's ideology. That's the right they have. But I can try to discredit the propaganda, to show that is a lie and misleading. What happens when people start believing propaganda? They're being cheated. They're being cheated of knowing the knowledge of how to make a proper decision. So if you listen to propaganda and you accept it, you're going to make decisions in your lives, or if you're a politician, you're going to make decisions about policy making that's going to be made on phony information. It's going to be based on junk science. And in the end, by definition, you're going to be making the wrong decisions.
So how politicians' decisions impacts the nature of the climate?
How politicians are going to what about the climate?
Their decisions or their thoughts are going to affect the climate.
If you look in the United States, you have a difficult situation. What you have is that when you talk about action on climate change, let's talk about action on climate change and the political action on climate change that's taking place. You know, for example, when Barack Obama was president, he made some strong legislation that was passed to cut greenhouse gases from power generation. He helped design the Paris Climate Agreement, which the US signed on to. But the problem in American politics is legislation is actually done by Congress. And Congress has the real power of making laws. The president can do certain legislation themselves, but it's very restricted. And the problem with that is when the next president comes in, he can just reverse it. And that's what Donald Trump did with Barack Obama. He essentially reversed everything about climate change that Barack had done. And that's because it wasn't a legislated policy as far as the United States was concerned. The one good thing about US policies that happened very recently, just within the last month or so, was the passage of the first climate legislation literally in US history. It's the first time that Congress passed a bill that had a major component in it related to climate change. And that was the Inflation Reduction Act. Didn't say anything about greenhouse gases or climate change in the title of the bill, but a good portion of that bill, I'm not quite sure what the size of it, maybe a third or a half, were related about incentives to stimulate both business and individuals to invest in green energy and to take action on climate change. So it wasn't a law to force people to reduce their emissions. It was an act to encourage people with financial stimulus to take positive action on climate change.
So, what are the negative effects of taking wrong decisions or not thinking about what exactly is happening when it comes to politicians?
Well, I think you can see it all around the world of all the different, as I was mentioning before, it doesn't matter what extreme weather event you have, you're seeing the impact of climate change. And the longer we take, the worse it keeps on getting. And let's say tomorrow, the world all came together and we stopped burning fossil fuels. So there was no more greenhouse gases going into the environment. The problem doesn't get better. What happens is it stops getting worse because the greenhouse gases are still in the atmosphere. They'll be there for centuries. So global warming is one of these problems. Greenhouse climate change is a problem that we have to first stop making it worse before we can start making it better. And so far, the world has just kept on making it worse.
We are one of the million species on this planet. So, are we able to alter or change the climate?
Climate change, of course, affects all life on the planet. And we are the one that's causing climate change today. And so it's up to us to stop climate change. This isn't something that's just happening. Climate change is caused by acts that we are doing. Again, the major one is from the burning of fossil fuels. And so it's up to us to stop it. Now, you and I can do what we can. It's good if we do on an individual basis everything we can, but we're not going to solve it. The problem is only going to be solved by politicians and big companies taking action on climate change. And that can happen. I think we're going slowly towards that direction, but it's important that we speed it up because, again, the longer we take, the longer it's going to take to fix it and the more effort it's going to take to fix it.
So, what politicians need to remember and put their in their mind about climate change?
It doesn't matter where you are, what country you're in. Your country will be affected and your citizens will be affected by climate change. And the longer we take, the more deadly and more destructive it's going to be. There's a huge cost for climate change that we see every day. Every time there's a large wildfire, every time there's a large heat dome, every time there's a major flood, the signature of climate change is there. And so governments are there to serve us, to protect us, to make our lives better today, and to make our lives better in the future. Well, if they're sincere about doing that for us, it's up to them to start taking action on climate change. This is not something that someone can suddenly say, okay, I'm going to take action on climate change and I'm going to solve it today. That's impossible. It's such a major issue. It's going to take time. But we have to get going on this. And as soon as you have a government that's denying climate change, as the Republican Party does in the United States, other political parties do it as well, you're essentially saying that you're not going to do anything about it, that you don't care. And I don't understand that. How can people not care? This is what politicians are supposed to do. And especially on an issue like this, there's, as I said before, there's only so much that ordinary individuals can do. We need the help of politicians to do it. We need the help of the big corporations. Once we hit a certain stage, companies will start taking care of climate change by themselves, but they have to be pushed to that level. And they need to be pushed partly by us and our buying habits, but also being pushed by politicians to start taking action.
So what is climate before and now?
That's always a good question. Like, what are we trying to get back to? If you look at the carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, and they have measurements that can go back well over 1,000 years. For most of that period of time, for the past millennium, it was relatively flat. Until you got into about the 1850s, 1880s, when it started to increase. Why did the CO2 in the atmosphere start to increase? It's because the Industrial Revolution had reached such a stage in the massive, first of all, burning of coal, it actually started putting billions of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. It just got worse when petroleum came into our economic systems and natural gas. And so since that time, it has gone up at an incredible fast rate. So there is no magical level or magical temperature that scientists want the world to be. What they want is that the carbon that we have contributed to stop and to go back to what it was before we started dumping essentially carbon garbage, carbon pollution into the atmosphere.
So how to raise this awareness?
Pardon me?
How to raise this awareness all around the world?
The one thing we have to look at, first of all, is that I sit here and I blame politicians. But who votes for the politicians? You and I do. And the problem is when we come to vote, there's always a whole pile of things that we're concerned about. But the problem we have is that climate change is a major, major issue. So we got to make sure that politicians understand how important this is to us, both from a personal level and also from a practical level of what's happening to our country and to our regions, to our farming industry and everything else, agriculture. You know, the implications of climate change are far reaching. It impacts almost every part of our lives that you can think of. There's no industrial sector that's not impacted by climate change. And so the one thing that we have to do is always keep the pressure up. It's not that we have one big demonstration and we yell at the politicians to do something and then we go away. That pressure has to be constant. It has to happen every day, and we have to make sure people understand if they want to be elected, then they have to take climate change seriously.
So how to deal with this denials?
Well, one way of dealing with denial is what I try to do in Twitter. I call it the climate brawl. And the climate brawl is fighting against the propaganda. If you can discredit the propaganda, the climate denialism can start falling apart. It's never going to disappear, but you can weaken it. The standard way of doing it in the past is that a climate denier would show a phony graph that showed information that wasn't true. And so what the natural thing is showing them the science that they were wrong and here was the real science. And I used to do that all the time as well. And the problem with that is the climate deniers, they don't care what you tell them. What they'll say, okay, what about this graph? What about this picture? And they can just go on like this forever. And each time the other person can sit there and show, well, here are the sciences that shows you're wrong. But what's happened in the meantime, you're having a debate. The people watching think there's a debate about the science. There's no debate about the science of climate change. There hasn't been a debate about science of climate change for decades. Science is clear what is happening. And so the climate deniers are gaining by just giving the impression that there is such a debate. And so what I do now is what I said before. I don't defend the science. I make them defend the garbage that they're showing that they call science that shows the climate change to be wrong. And they can't. They have no defense for what they're showing. There's not that many things that they say. There's probably a couple of dozen things. And all they do is repeat it over and over and over again. So it's very important, I believe, that when we deal with climate denialism and trying to mute its impact, especially on politicians, is to discredit it and discredit what their sources are. Because remember, the climate deniers have no science that support them. And I literally mean no science. And so it's just amazing they've been around for as long as they have when they have nothing of substance to support their cause.
Are we going to give the same to the next generation?
Right now, the big issue, face it, I'm a generation or two older than you are. Unfortunately, you're going to suffer the consequences of climate change a lot worse than I am. And when you have kids, or if you have kids, it's going to be worse for them as well. Every generation is going to suffer it more and more and more. And the only way we're going to prevent that from continuing like that is how quickly we take action. Remember, the big thing about climate change, when we finally stop emitting greenhouse gases, we haven't solved the problem. We've just stopped it from getting worse. And so when you look at what's happening for future generations, if we stopped it today, they would be stuck with what we have today, which is bad enough. But if it takes us to 2050 to finally stop, even if we're lucky enough to do it by then, that's what the governments are saying they're trying to do, between now and 2050, it's just going to have gotten worse. So again, for its future generations, that it's bad enough for us today. It's here today and causing lots of death and destruction. But again, it's just going to be worse in the future.
So all industries are connected with this climate. So what do you say to the decision makers?
What do I think about?
All industries on this planet are connected with climate.
Yes.
So what do you say to the decision makers?
It's sort of sad that we even have to say anything, because it's pretty apparent. It affects the livelihood of everyone. It affects all national economies. You know, the climate, when you talk about climate change, it doesn't mean that every single place gets bad weather at the same time. You may go for a long period of time with having very strong adverse effects. But when you have one of those adverse effects, they're not minor. That's why it's called extreme. It's not unusual to have an event that was supposed to happen once a century. They may happen once or twice a decade, where there's tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of damage when it goes on. And this damage can be in all sorts of effects. It can be in infrastructure, it can be loss of life, it can be loss of natural resources with fires. You know, it just goes on and on. The problem we have is that it goes back to why this climate denialism is such a serious issue. A lot of these politicians, they're not stupid. A lot of them are highly educated. So it's not that they don't know what's going on. They don't want to know what's going on. And so somehow we have to get what's called political will, because you're dealing with a politician. First thing you have to do is show him what's wrong. And then what you have to do is reach a stage with that politician that he understands what's wrong, and now he has the political will to do something about it. And so far, a lot of politicians don't have the will to do something about it. Even when their region or country has been hard hit by an extreme weather event, they still say, oh, it's natural. It had nothing to do with climate change. Science disagrees with that.
So how to make the politician understand about the climate change and also make understand to the climate deniers?
Of course, the politicians or climate deniers don't believe they're climate deniers, right? They believe they're right and we're wrong. We're some sort of left-wing nutcases. They're just trying to make their lives more miserable. With politicians, there's two approaches. One, you just keep on hammering home that why the climate denialism is wrong, why the propaganda is wrong, but also your vote. the most powerful thing that those of us that live in democracies is we vote the politicians in. And so if you have someone that will not accept taking action on climate change, then you can't vote for them. And that's hard because any election, there's usually many issues that are coming up. But the thing is that climate change has become so important. If I see a politician who's a climate denier, I won't vote for him in any circumstances. And that's a horrible situation to be in. But that's how serious it's become, and that we have to be willing to do that. Now, who you vote for, I will never tell you to do that. But I do try to tell people all the time. I tell them who not to vote for, and that is not to vote for a climate denier.
So how can these voters can contribute to the climate change?
Well, we talked about this a little bit before. Individuals can do a lot themselves. You know, they can try to reduce their energy use. They can use less amounts of fossil fuels with the resources that they have. And the best way of doing that is always try. And so it's not that everyone can put solar panels on their house or buy an electric car. That's great if you can. But the important point is that you're thinking about all the time, how can I reduce my own greenhouse gas emissions? And that is a good thing to do. And it does have an effect. And it will have an effect on the marketplace as well, because your buying habits affect what companies want to do. But really, the one thing that you have, and I'll repeat this over and over again, is your vote, your vote, your vote. It's a very powerful tool. In democracies, again, these people are elected by the people. And so it's up to the people to make sure a climate denier is never elected into government under any circumstances.
So how much time it took to the humanity or to other species or to other living beings on this planet uh, uh, about the climate change? How much time it takes to create effect?
If you look at when climate change started to be, I guess, a little bit more serious, when a better question would be, when was a scientific consensus more or less in place that agreed that climate change was being caused by us, was a serious effect, and we had to do something about it? That probably took place by the 1980s. So the science was at a stage. Now, at that time, climate change was not hitting the world that hard. I think since the new millennium, we started to see it. When you start to see it, it's starting to be too late. What science wants you to do is to take action before you start suffering from it. That's why science warns early on. Science was yelling since the 1950s, hey, you're going to have to do something about climate change in the future. You're going to start paying for it. And so the problem is we did nothing. And so starting around, certainly in the new millennium, we started seeing the impact of climate change with our own eyes. And now we're seeing it all the time. You know, it seems like every single day there's another extreme weather event. There's another heat dome. And keeping in mind, climate change does not cause these events. Okay, weather events are caused by a whole pile of things. But what it has a tendency to do is to make them more frequent and more severe. And so just like I said before, there's been many events that an area may have seen once in a century or even once in a millennium. And now they're starting to see it much more. They're seeing it a couple times a decade. And maybe in a few years, they'll start seeing it every year. And so that's what's changing as it goes on. So we're actually seeing climate change now with our own eyes. And we're still slow to react to it, at least as far as the politicians are concerned.
So who need to become a politician?
I guess we all need to become politicians to a certain extent. It's important that we talk about this with our friends. It's also important, especially with your local politicians, get to know them. It's hard because most of them are just strangers to us. You know, we see someone's name on a ballot and we make a little check mark when we go to vote for them because we read something nice about them in the press. But do your homework. Try to learn more about what these people are doing. And when a politician is in office, especially your local politician, meet with them. That's what they're there for. Your local politicians are there to help you and make sure they're aware of your concerns. Politicians, what do politicians want to do? They want to get reelected. Just make sure they know that you're going, yeah, I voted for you the last election, but if you don't start doing something, I'm not going to vote for you in the next one. That's a good way to influence a politician.
How different industries expert can influence or can make this as a big revolution so that we can uh, do what we can do.
Ultimately, when you look at everything we're talking about here, of course, politicians don't create greenhouse gases. And personally, we're not creating that much either. Most of the greenhouse gases are coming from industry. They're coming from all sorts of industry. They come also from transportation, from us driving cars and goods being transported by trucks. A lot of it comes from power generation, where coal and oil are being used for generating power. A lot of industries, cement, for example, steel industry, it just goes on and on. And then there's other industries that, like the Amazons of the world and Google and even Twitter. Just by their existence and how they operate, they produce lots of greenhouse gases. And so ultimately, whatever we're heading towards, including the actions of politicians, is get industry to think what I asked you and I to do. You and I should be thinking about our greenhouse gas emissions every single day. Industry should be doing the same thing. And I mean, seriously, how can I cut back greenhouse gases as quickly as possible? No one's asking you to destroy your company. We're just asking to make steady progress. And that mentality doesn't really exist. A lot of industries will talk about great grandiose plans. They're going to stop their greenhouse gas emissions and they're going to be net zero by 2050 and stuff like that. I want to see them doing hard things. See, greenwashing, as it's called, is an easy thing to do. And greenwashing is where you say lots of grandiose things and you do very little. We can't afford industry to do that any longer. Industry has to be on board because if we don't have a future, they don't have a future either.
So why many people won't talk about climate change effect?
I think the people that they always talk about the silent majority. People usually keep them themselves. They're usually a little bit shy. They don't like to speak about controversial issues. If your relative is a climate denier, it doesn't matter who he is, could be an uncle, it could be an aunt, it could be a cousin, it could be your best friend. You obviously have a close relationship with that person. It's hard to bring up a substance like climate change because when you do, you know it's going to be controversy with that person. But you should do it. You don't have to be rude about it. No one's saying get mad at the other person because they don't understand the problem. But you're actually helping them out by helping them understand what that problem is. And so people have to get outside their comfort zone. Because the problem you have is silence is an enabler of propaganda. So when propaganda is out there, doesn't matter what type it is, and people are silent about it, that's what propaganda wants. That's how propaganda gains power. And so we talk about the propaganda of climate denialism. If you're not talking about it, if you're not challenging it, indirectly you're supporting it. So there's no room for the silent majority in this case. And so again, we're not talking about getting mad at people or being rude, but talk to people. Talk to people you care about. Talk to people that you're friends. When you're in a group, talk about it. Talk about it all the time.
So climate changes from one state to other state. So how to make these politicians to change their one mindset to another mindset?
That one I haven't figured out yet. And When we talk about climate deniers, there's actually two major types. There's the average person that's not so sure about it and is quiet about it and really doesn't see much happening. The real problem are the hardcore climate deniers. These are the people that are really pushing that propaganda, and they're on Twitter every single day saying, oh, it's a hoax, it's a scam, it's not real. And there's politicians like that as well. And some of them are elite politicians. Some of them are leaders of countries. It's those hardcore climate deniers that the rest of the population will follow. When Donald Trump was president of the United States, the greatest economic power in the world, and he said horrible lies constantly about climate change. But if you're an ordinary citizen and the president of your country says these things, you're naturally going to be swayed by that. And there are other elite politicians that can be, head of a legislative body or head of, be in the cabinet of a government. They're climate deniers. These are supposed to be people that we're supposed to respect. And so these are the most dangerous ones that we have to deal with. They are the ones that have the greatest influence over other people.
So how a leader of the country can change the climate?
Well, it depends what country you're in. If you're in the United States, you saw what Barack Obama had done. And the problem is he did certainly positive aspects, but the work that he had done was weak as far as politics were concerned. So when Donald Trump came in, he just reversed it. Joe Biden was trying his best to get Congress to react, because as I mentioned, in the republic system that the United States has, the legislative body is Congress, which means they pass the bills, they pass the laws. And so finally we have a major step. It's still way too little, by the way, but because it's the first step of legislation in the United States, it's a major deal. In other countries, the president or the prime minister has actually got more political power, and they can actually force through legislation almost on their own. But what they're nervous about is most of them want to get reelected. And as soon as you pass any legislation, you say, well, why wouldn't anyone go against trying to stop climate change? It sounds like the perfect thing to do. The first thing the opposition does is starts with a propaganda campaign. They'll start yelling out, you're just trying to hurt the poor. You're just trying to cause energy poverty. You're sitting out there and you want to hurt small businesses. None of it's true. But that's the problem with propaganda. In an aggressive campaign, that's what you have to deal with. And again, we're coming right back in this circle. Propaganda comes back again and again and again. The truth is so much harder to prove than throwing out lies. That's all propaganda is, by the way. It's made up of lies, but it's an organized campaign of lies. And so what happens is, this is what we have to try our best to fight against. It's what the media should fight against as well. So much of media today is just reporting on someone saying something. But investigative reporting is that they used to check to see if what someone was saying was the truth or not. And reporters do that less and less these days. And we have a tendency to listen to what reporters are saying in the major media outlets, whether it's on the television or social media, where they're having their blogs, or it's a newspaper, wherever the case may be. They need to help us on this as well, of calling these politicians out with their phony excuses and lies.
If you are a politician, what is your plan about climate change?
If I was a politician tomorrow about climate change, what would be my plan? I would truly do my best. It's hard to make action against something that's so involved in everyone's life that isn't bipartisan, that isn't where you bring the political parties together to try to come up with an agreement. That is so hard in most countries in today's world, but for climate change, it's really important. I would truly try to do that. But there has to be some basic rules before we even try to do it. The first one is you can't deny the science. That's not an issue. This is make-believe that that's been done. So we have to accept that the science is real. Essentially, the IPCC reports are a great way of doing that. You also have to have the political will that, yes, I am willing to do something about climate change. This is so basic, but literally it's the major roadblock we have. Once we have that, there's no problem of arguing what those policies should be. That's what politicians are supposed to do. They're supposed to argue what's the best action that should be taken. But in places like the United States, they never even get to that stage. All they're doing is they're arguing whether, oh, the science isn't real, it's no good, stuff like that. That's not the role of politicians. The idea of a government is not to say this science is right or this science is wrong. That's what scientists do. And so what we should be, I would do my best, and it probably wouldn't work very well, to at least take that first step to bring politicians together, saying, okay, we're in the room, we accept the science. What do we think as a group is the best way forward? Now, you have to be open about this, because that means the options that are coming from the more right-wing politicians have to be listened to. The goal is, at the end of the day, we have to reach a certain level. That is going to have to be set without debate. But how we get there, that is truly open for discussions if everybody at the table is willing to do their best to reach that end game.
So how can all leaders of all countries can able to work on this climate change?
What's that? That's what the COP meetings, the Conference of the Party meetings that have happened to bring the international leadership together to work as a group. And actually, this is very important for climate change because it's not a national issue. It's an international issue. All countries eventually have to do their own on this, or it's not going to save anybody. The most famous conference of the parties was in 1997, you had Kyoto. You had Rio before that in 1992. It started the ball rolling. Kyoto, they came out with an international agreement. It did not work. It did a lot of positive things of getting organized, but it certainly did not work. The next big one after that was the Paris Agreement in 2015. That's the one we're working off of now. The last COP meeting was in Glasgow. Not a lot happened, and not a lot happens at a lot of the COP meetings, by the way. The next one is in Egypt. And so what you're trying to do is that, who's to blame for this? It's not the UN. The United Nations, they're there to coordinate these meetings and bring people together and try to push them in the right direction. But the UN is not a regulatory body. The UN is a coordinating body. And so they can bring the politicians into a room together. They can help convince them what they should go forward. But the politicians have complete control. They decide exactly what they want to do. And so the COP process is very important. It's what's going to edge forward the international community. I think they are edging it forward. It's much too slow. It's not clear whether they can push any harder because no country has to obey the UN. There isn't a UN law. There's not a UN police force. But if there's a will to support the measures by the UN, which generally are, in this case, are well documented and is the benefit of everyone. Hopefully, as more and more politicians see the serious nature of climate change overall, they will listen to more and more about taking collective action against climate change.
Are we not able to explain what is change?
We can explain it, but for the people that don't want to hear it, they don't hear it. And that's the problem we have. The climate change is, the basics of climate change are easy to share. And again, we don't even have to listen to the scientists anymore. So often we can see it happening. outside our own windows, which is a pretty frightful event at times. In fact, there are times where many people die and there's massive death and destruction. And so you can't force someone to listen, but you should try. And the important thing here is, regardless of what happens, the important thing for all of us is never stop trying. The idea is, again, talk to your relatives, talk to your local politicians, make sure you vote, take care of your own greenhouse emissions as far as you can. We got to keep on doing those things, even if it seems that other people are not. Because if we stop, we're no different than they are.
So, in the priority list, what is climate to a politician?
That's always a problem. For a person like me, it's number one. But I'm not the leader of the country. There's probably very few leaders of any country where it's number one. And the one thing I've noticed is that climate change will vary. There's sort of a popularity to it. You know, if someone like Greta Thunberg is having a massive global climate strike, it'll suddenly become up in the top 2 or 3. In a lot of countries, it's often in the top 10. It can often be in the top 2 or 3. It doesn't reach number 1 too often. And the problem with that is it's not that it's not near the top and an important issue. Politicians have a tendency not to be able to focus on too many things at the same time. And certainly when it comes to crises, they only can handle one crisis at a time. So when COVID came along, governments spent all their effort taking care of the number one crisis, which was COVID. And there was a odd little thing that was done about climate change, and climate change might have been not too much below that. And the problem is, climate change is a long-term problem. It's going to keep on going for decades. Governments react to immediate problems. So tomorrow, the energy crisis caused by the Ukraine-Russian war, that's the latest crisis that a lot of countries are looking at. And tomorrow there'll be another crisis. And climate change hardly ever gets bumped up to that number one status crisis. And even if you look at the full extent of climate change, it should be on everyone's number one list.
So, if a politician decides to start changing the climate, start working on the climate change today, so how much we can do and how much time it takes?
Any one politician, any one leader of a country is not going to stop climate change. What you have to do, though, is you do have to lead by example. If, for example, we want all the countries, literally all the countries of the world to take action on climate change, it's up to others to lead by example. And so it's not that, take the leader of any country, it doesn't matter. Well, we'll take Joe Biden, for example. Joe Biden could find a way of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from the United States, and there still be a climate crisis. It still would be getting worse because the other nations have not joined in. The big impact, though, is leading by example. And what you do is you gain momentum. If one person does it, one leader does it, then another, and then there's more and more pressure for others to go along with that as well. And so you need that momentum to happen. It's whether you're talking about from individuals or you're talking about from politicians or you're talking about from industries. It starts with a few leading. And once you get that and they keep on leading and others will slowly join in, it's like a snowball going down a hill. Eventually it will start gaining momentum and more countries around the world will do it. That's the most important thing of the major leaders of certainly of the OECD countries. Top 20 economic countries in the world. They're in a more of a position to lead on this than anyone else is. And certainly when you're talking about countries like the United States and Western Europe, they have more economic abilities to do it. That doesn't stop other countries from doing things. The important thing is that when you and I are talking about this, like wherever this leader is, whatever country they're in, they all can't do the same thing. They don't have the resources to do that. But if they're trying their best with the resources they have, that's what we want. It's like I was saying before, always think of what you can do to make better. It includes with people. If you're a multimillionaire, you can do a lot more about reducing your greenhouse gases than if you're not a multimillionaire. But if you're thinking of what you can do with the resources you have, that applies to the individual or it applies to the leader of any country in the world.
How these denials are stopping the great decisions?
How denial? Sorry, I missed that.
Stopping the great decisions.
I'm not quite getting the question, but if you're asking about how does climate denial stop the politicians?
Stop the politicians take great decisions about climate change.
About decisions on climate change?
Yeah.
What it does is essentially propaganda pollutes the mind. It really does. And by the way, we focus with climate change more on right-wing politicians, but there's pollutions of the mind for left-wing politicians as well. It's just different. And so when you're talking about, the most important thing is that what are the facts? And we're not talking about controversial facts. There's controversial issues that people are still discussing. When it is for sure that certain situations exist, that's where propaganda comes in. The one thing that the oil industry learned a long time ago, they could not win this war on science. They found that out in the 60s and 70s. They had no chance of winning this debate on science. So the only chance they had was to make sure that they attacked the science and put doubt in people's minds that the science was legitimate, which is all phony. But when you're talking about putting in tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into some of the top public relation firms in the world, it turns into a giant advertising campaign. And they repeat and repeat and repeat. And people see this and they just presume it's true. Why shouldn't they presume it's true? And so that's where you run into a serious problem. Propaganda doesn't look like propaganda. It looks like the way life is supposed to be. And that's where the deceit comes in. And that's why it's so easy to confuse people and literally cheat them of making the proper decision.
So at last, what do you say to the leaders and rulers, decision makers, experts, and for watching this video and listening to you? What do you want to tell to them?
I'll use the famous words of Greta Thunberg. Listen to the science. Science is not your enemy. Science is your friend. It's trying to help. And the most important thing of all is do something. So listen to the science, as you and I talked about before, with the resources that you have available to you. What can you do today and what can you do tomorrow? And you keep on thinking about that all the time. And that's how we're going to conquer the climate crisis.
So any person who is listening to you after many years, this audio conversation or video conversation, what you want to tell to that person if he is ruling the world?
Really no difference. Climate change, it is so hard talking about something like climate change where there is so much of this propaganda that's out there. It doesn't affect a couple of people. It's not like 10% of the population is affected by the propaganda. In a lot of countries, it's half the population is affected by the propaganda. It's monstrous. It's scary the numbers are so high. And so try your best to make sure that when you're learning about climate change or whatever you're learning about, check the credentials of your sources. That's an easier thing to do. You know how it is. So people on social media, or you do a Google search, and you can find sites on everything. What's different among those sites is the credibility of those sites that's behind them. Some of them are pure climate denial garbage dumps. Literally, it's just one lie after another. Some of them are the most respected scientific organizations in the world. So be careful whenever you're looking for information on climate change. Check out the credibility of the sources that you're looking at.
Can you share some of the resources that from which they can learn and understand the exact information?
I have a favorite site of mine. It's NASA Climate. It's a beautifully laid out website. The information on it is fantastic. It's nice and easy to read. It's easy to surf. You can read the IPCC reports and stuff like that, but they're a little bit dull actually, and it takes a lot of work. But someone like the NASA Climate, like NASA has a great reputation. They have laid out almost every major question out there on what the effects are of climate change, what the future effects are going to be. They answer so many questions out there. That's the one I recommend usually, well, literally all the time for anyone to look at. And it's just called NASA Climate.
So what last question is, so I understand you are a very experienced person. So what is the major difference that you are observing in climate that that you observed before? I mean, when you was a child and now.
The one thing that's come about is that, and I actually wrote an op-ed piece about this. Natural disasters aren't so natural anymore. You know, people talk about natural disasters all the time. A tornado hits, a flood hits. And the idea is natural disasters have nothing to do with us. It's just nature has caused this, and look at the disaster it's caused. And there's still natural disasters, and nature still plays a role. But now we are influencing this more and more. In fact, it's a lot more. And so they're only sort of natural now. We're to blame for a lot of these things. And so you know there's something wrong where it doesn't matter where you are. If there is a flood and 20%, I'm just picking a number, 20% is caused by climate change. That's a lot. So 20% of the damage is my fault. And my fault, I mean the human species. We got to get our act together. We have enough problems as a species without contributing to our own demise by contributing to natural disasters.
So you're saying that if we don't take this as a very serious thing, we are going to search for natural things in future.
What's going to happen if we don't take climate change seriously, especially politicians take climate change seriously? Climate change is literally going to get worse for almost forever. And so we haven't seen anything yet. And it's scary what's going to happen. And the idea is that it's going to take us decades, if not centuries, to get this back under control once we decide to stop it. But that political will isn't there yet. And so we're not even at that stage yet. We should have been discussing this 30, 40 years ago, what we should have been doing to stopping it. We're still arguing whether the science says we should bother stopping it. We are insane as a species that we've taken that attitude. And so the problem we're going to have is that, and I can't stress this enough, the longer we delay, the worse it's going to get, the more expensive it will be to stop it, and the more expensive it will be to take it back to some sort of normality where we are not influencing the climate anymore.
So definitely your words and your explanation and your observation and your your complete concept that you said will reach definitely reach the experts and top people who are ruling the world and who are ruling the world on different parts of the world. Especially my country people will definitely know what you said, and they understood the consequences of not taking this seriously, and what they can do and what they can contribute, and what happens if they don't do it. So yeah.
Just the last word. The one thing that happens a lot is that someone else's fault. It's America's fault. It's China's fault. And we have a tendency to point at everybody. The important thing about climate change is everybody's fault. And everybody has to get a solution for it. Now, it doesn't mean we're all equal in that as it goes on. But pointing fingers doesn't do any good. It doesn't matter. It actually doesn't matter. Let's say it's all the US's fault. That doesn't matter. We have to work together to stop it. And that's what's happening right now is we can't use climate change as being divisive among countries and governments because arguing isn't going to do anything. The arguments have to stop. Working together is what has to begin. And if we're always threatening people or arguing over who does what, I really don't care about that. I want us to start working together, or as I mentioned earlier on, every government, every person, every industry. How can I make today better? How can I make tomorrow better with the resources I have available to me? That's a win-win for everybody. And that is a positive way of gaining that momentum that we can finally stop this.
So at last, what is your observation about my work? Have you seen any videos of mine on YouTube?
I must admit, I don't watch YouTube a lot. I'm so tied up with Twitter. So I apologize. I haven't seen a lot. I'll watch this one for sure, though.
So I'll take interviews of different country people and who are into different professions and who are into different parts of the world, who are experts. Especially, I'm an IT guy. I did software and masters in software engineering and bachelor's in computer science and engineering. So other than my technical work, I'm doing this social work to create awareness and to send word to the planet. And I have huge social media presence.
Fantastic.
So how this work is going to helpful for me in future?
Wow, that's up to you, right? Let's put it this way. You know what's going to happen if you don't do anything. It's going to get worse. If we do something, let's say just you do something, at least there's a chance it's going to be better. If 2 people do something, there's twice the chance it's going to do better. If 4 billion of us decide to do better, odds are we're going to be able to turn things around. And so, there's an old saying, how do you move a mountain? And that saying goes, 1 rock at a time. Climate change is going to be like that. It's just we've waited so long, we got to get a move on. So we got to move these rocks really, really fast. And so anything that we can do to motivate people, we can only gain. Let's put it another way. Trying to change the climate today isn't going to cost anyone anything. It's not that you're going to be penalized because you're trying to do something better by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so the idea is that you have everything to gain and literally nothing to lose in this. So it just makes common sense that we should be trying our best at this.
So can you tell about your resources details to my podcast listeners so that they can get it?
My what details?
Your resources. Your
Pardon?
resources.
My
The
resources?
resources. Yeah, your resources to my podcast listeners.
So, are you talking about like the NASA climate that I was referring to before?
Yeah, website or social media or anything where they can get
Well,
information.
I certainly hope a lot of your viewers will follow me on Twitter. My handle is Gerald Kutney. It's easy. I'm pretty easy to find. If you put in climate denialism on a search on Twitter, usually I'll show up. Certainly, if you put in climate brawl on Twitter, you'll find my name coming out quite quickly as it goes on. I don't do a lot in other social media. I do a little bit, but the main thing, as I mentioned before, is always on Twitter. There's a lot of good people trying to do something on Twitter. We have a group. It's called Friends of Climate Brawl. It's a list that I keep. We have over 500 people that are listed on that. There's actually much more of those friends, but I only have over 500 on the list so far, and literally they're from around the world. And on that list, a few are scientists. Very few of them are. Most of them are all sorts of people from all over the place. They're young, old, in between. Some are engineers, some are school teachers, some are grocery clerks. It doesn't matter what you do as a job. It's all important when it comes to fighting climate change that you try to do your best.
I'll put your web links in the description of this video on YouTube. People who find the video on YouTube can see the work that you're doing and the information that you're giving. And also I'll put your web links on the screen as well. They can see it and they can go through it.
Sounds
Can
good.
I put this video on my YouTube channel with your
Oh
permission?
yes, please do.
Yeah. And also can I put
Okay.
this? Yeah. Can I put this audio and video clip on my podcast, website, internet, social media, everywhere with your permission?
Yep. And give me a link for I can share it.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you very much,
Oh,
Gerald,
that's
for
lovely.
giving me.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you again. Keep going, keep doing what you're doing, and make the world the better place.
And you too, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.